take home as well and refer to. So I'd like to invite Paul Thompson up. Now, Paul is the Group Executive Editor for Fairfax New Zealand, and he's going to be talking today about challenging the taboo, reporting suicide effectively. Welcome, Paul.
Good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here. I've enjoyed the day so far, even the Minister's speech. And I particularly enjoyed Jane's very powerful presentation in which she summarised the state of play in terms of our understanding of the copycat effect and the impact of all sorts of media coverage of suicide on real people's lives. And if there's one key step that I think I'd like to do with the editors I work with is to get Jane in front of them. Might explain what my job is. I'm a former reporter, former journalist in the trenches, former health reporter. I've covered quite a bit of suicide as a reporter in my time. Then I went on to become a newspaper editor, and in my current role I'm editor-in-chief of Fairfax. All the editors in our group report to me on editorial matters, but they also have editorial independence with the way we structure our company. So I'm there to support, guide them, help them develop their publications, make sure we do it right, but they have a large degree of autonomy in the news decisions they make, and there has to be that way because they know their readership, they know their newsrooms better than anyone. So it just gives you a bit of context in terms of what I do in my job. As I said, thank you for the opportunity to speak today and to provide what I hope will be some constructive comments about the media's role in reporting suicide in an accurate, balanced and above all responsible manner. And by responsible, I don't just mean in a manner that makes sure that our reporting doesn't cause inadvertent harm. I also mean in a manner that is responsible in terms of our duties as journalists and that we keep doing our job, which is such an important one in our society. I'm just wondering whether I'm among friends. How many working journalists are in the room? That's fantastic. How many student journalists? Yep, no, that's good to see. I thought I'd start by trying to provide an insight for those others in the room into what motivates us to get so fired up and stroppy about the coverage of suicide. And it does go to that, I think, at times. First, it's not because we're ghouls or that we take any pleasure at all in covering such tragic and traumatic events. In my experience, nothing could be further from our minds, and I know how hard it is on individual journalists to do some of these stories. Nor is it because we feel compelled to challenge New Zealand's highly restrictive regime around the reporting of suicide, which, as we know, is the most restrictive in the world. That certainly is a factor for us, but it's not what drives us. Instead, I think there are two other key things at work. First, and quite simply, we are motivated by our commitment to report important news that we believe our readers need to know and to understand. I think it's really easy, and probably it's getting easier, unfortunately, to be cynical about journalism and journalists these days. And we certainly dish out the criticism, and we need to be able to take it. But the truth is that for all our faults, we do sincerely believe we have a duty to tell it like it is, even when you don't want to hear it. Even when our job involves challenging a taboo, and perhaps particularly when it comes to challenging a taboo. Second, and this is probably the point I want to emphasise more, for most of us as journalists, our views on reporting suicide are often shaped by personal experience. For example, I once worked with a news editor in a regional newspaper who was adamant we needed to cover suicide as a major social ill in our community. Our reporting needed to be robust, it needed to be direct and clear. We needed to call a spade a spade. News editors, for those of you who don't know, are the gods of the newsrooms. They decide which stories go in the paper, where they go and what prominence they're given. And this former colleague of mine was a passionate advocate for this sort of vigorous reporting of self-inflicted deaths. I'd worked with him for a year or more before I learned that his father had taken his life, and that really was what motivated this chap to be so vehement in his views, and it certainly helped me as editor to sort of understand some of the dynamics in the room and what was happening in the paper, but it also underlined the point that I'm trying to make, that we're affected by this issue as well. We're not apart from society, we're part of society, and any problem that's affecting society does affect us on a personal level. But there's another way in which it affects us, and that is Many of us have had extremely difficult experiences writing heart-wrenching stories about suicide, dealing with the privacy issues, dealing with the deadline issues, the demands of the editors, the demands of the readers, the fear and the taboos that surround this subject. One example I'll give from my own experience as a health reporter is a series of stories I wrote about an HIV-positive caregiver in the community who took his life after allegations of child abuse were levelled against him. I can't think of a worse mix of factors. It was terrible. It was significant news because there was a police investigation underway. There are serious issues and questions around what had happened and how his employer had managed things and the impact on the child. And I vividly recall wrestling with this story and feeling sick about it. And I recall most of all receiving a phone call from the dead man's grief-stricken father. And it's probably the most difficult call I've ever taken because I simply couldn't do anything. And I had to listen. It was just tragic. In a more positive way, some of us as journalists are lucky enough to have constructive experiences when covering this really difficult issue. And I don't mean that it was pleasant, but that we probably feel we got it right and made a contribution. And a couple of years ago, when I was editor of the Press in Christchurch, we noticed that there were, I think, 14 self-inflicted deaths on the coroner's list for the next day. And we worked with Richard McElrea, the coroner, to see whether he would allow us to report more details of those than we usually would be allowed to. He liaised with the families, and I think one or two of the families didn't want to be part of that, but most were cooperated. We played it in a very straight manner. We called the series The Hidden Toll. We carefully explained the context of what we were doing. We talked about this being it was about mental illness, it was about depression, it was about alcohol and drug abuse, and those factors were clearly seen in the testimony in the coroner's court. And it was challenging reporting. We got some strong feedback, positive and negative about it, but I think it was a good example of us doing our job as we need to. I don't expect all of you to agree on that, but I think it was, as I say, a good example of how perhaps it can be done in a cooperative way with coroners and families. It's not something you'd want to do every week. It's not something you need to go overboard on, but occasionally those opportunities are there. The point I'm making is that journalists' views on suicide are shaped by such experiences as this, as well as by our professional and ethical duties. The topic of my talk today is challenging the taboo, reporting suicide effectively. And I think the key challenge I have is to explain what reporting the issue effectively actually means, and to provide both an industry perspective and a personal view on that question. First, some background. Coverage of suicide is one of the most challenging areas any editor or journalist in New Zealand faces. A death toll of 500 will always be significant news. Making sense of that in an appropriate way isn't easy. Our reporting is constrained by law, it's constrained by social convention and by public taste. It's further clouded by issues of personal grief and intrusions of privacy. Another complication is the ongoing battle, perhaps too strong a word, but it has been quite tense at times with health professionals and suicide prevention researchers about the effects, positive or negative, that arise when suicides are covered in a particular manner. And obviously the need for New Zealand research is evident to us all, and I understand that's underway, which is positive, and I look forward to reading that. But I think, as I mentioned in my opening comments, getting editors and journalists to understand what the research actually means and getting their heads across that is probably the biggest goal that we need to throw at ourselves and make sure it happens. I think you can throw into this mix the fact that some journalists are ignorant of what they can and cannot do. They're fearful when it comes to this topic, and it's easy to see why it's a potential minefield. What is surprising is that, as others have said today, most coverage of suicide in New Zealand is responsible, it's accurate, it's balanced, and it's kept in perspective. We do generally take a moderate approach. We do manage to balance freedom of expression and our duties as journalists with those constraints that I mentioned before. To give a couple of quick examples, would you see coverage like this in New Zealand? He danced for the PM, then stabbed a woman 14 times and hanged himself. Front page, SMH. Or this. story and the level of detail it gave on a prominent politician's attempt on her life. So, whilst we have certain pressure points and issues that we certainly are wrestling, we generally do get it right. Indeed, in the past 5 years or so, I think we've improved our performance in this area a lot more as researchers, health professionals and agencies involved in suicide have worked more cooperatively and respectfully with us, and we've done the same with them, which is fantastic. I believe a consensus of sorts has been formed, one that is fluid and still evolving, but which has nevertheless created common ground that we can all operate on. And I think the consensus runs something like this. Firstly, we accept the media has the right and the responsibility to cover this major health problem. Second, but we must do it in a responsible manner, and we must be informed. And again, going back to that, we need to know what the research says, not simply what we think it should say. It's better for us all to work together respectfully and professionally to ensure our understanding and handling of this complex issue continues to improve. And lastly, there are some simple things that we can do as media outlets to ensure that our coverage does not create inadvertent harm. I think it's important at this point to point out that I'm not saying everything's perfect or rosy. This is really tricky terrain, and while progress has been made, pressure points remain, and we need to be honest about those. A good example of that would be some of the criticism that I heard this morning around the Sunday News story at the weekend. I've also heard some journalists in commenting on the story making the point that, well, we can do what we like. It was an attempted suicide, therefore it's not covered by the Act. I think that misses the point, and perhaps what we need to do with our guidelines and with our protocols is to emphasise that it's not just about the suicides where someone actually dies, it's also about the wider issues where people try to take their life but survive. There may be some questions later on today about the Sunday News. I thought it would be quite good to take you quickly through the factors that influence the kind of decisions that journalists make, what's going through an editor's mind when faced with a story about suicide and the prospect of challenging the taboo. So it's largely about news judgment, and these are the simple criteria we like to use. Is it new? Is it interesting? Is it important? Does it have a strong human factor? Does it affect real people? What will the impact be? And how do we tell the whole story? So those are the sorts of things that are going through editors' minds when perhaps they're faced with any story, including a story on a self-inflicted death. Then they'll probably turn to the Coroner's Act, which is a restrictive regime, as we know. I'll read a bit of it out. No person may, without a coroner's authority, make public any particular relating to the manner of death, the manner in which a death occurred. If the death occurred in New Zealand after the commencement of the section, there is reasonable cause to believe the death was self-inflicted and no inquiry into the death has been completed. The only grounds on which a coroner may under the section authorise the making public of particulars of the death is unlikely to be detrimental to public safety. So the editor at this point may look at his news judgment, weighing up whether there's a story here, is it new, is it important, do our readers need to know this? What does the Coroner's Act say? At this point they'll probably get their editors, their lawyers in, perhaps to have a look at it and get some legal advice. And then they'll hopefully turn to our protocols, which have been developed by the Commonwealth Press Union Freedom Committee Press Freedom Committee, and Fairfax Media has adopted these protocols, and our editors are guided by them. Just read out a part of it. Individual suicides may be inherently newsworthy and need to be reported. In such cases, a responsible approach will consider the potential for news coverage to both contribute to cause further harm and to communicate positive message that may save lives. It also talks about avoiding presenting suicide as a method of coping with personal problems, avoiding focusing only on the deceased person's positive characteristics, avoid language or images or presentation that glorifies, trivialises or romanticises. Where appropriate, include community resources available for those at risk. I won't read them all, but I think they are a good starting point in terms of effective guidelines. They do need to continue to evolve, though. So editors will be weighing up all those factors and making decisions, and some editors will make different decisions from other editors. And if you look at the coverage of the Tony Veitch story over the weekend, which papers and news outlets picked it up, which didn't, that does underline that point that editors are autonomous. They'll work within these guidelines, within the Act, with their own news judgment and make their own decisions. Another story featuring Sunday News is probably worth flicking up. A good example of something which definitely has some news value, but which was played out with a lot of prominence. Certainly some significant issues there, both of the public policy kind, and also some real grief for some individuals concerned. I would say that this story is not typical in terms of how newspapers tend to cover these matters now. Just want to end by talking about my approach when I was in the editor's chair. Firstly, I did not like the fact that we used that code to confuse readers, I think, and create even more of a taboo around suicide when there was a suspected self-inflicted death. And rather than saying that it was a suspected suicide, we'd use the code of the body's been found, no suspicious circumstances, the matter's been referred to the coroner. I thought that that was a mistake for us to do that, and that there was no need for us to do that, and that we should, if it is a suspected suicide and it's newsworthy, we should call it that, and that's appropriate to do so. I think the second thing I tried to do was work with the coroner where appropriate, choose your moments, and see whether you can do it in a collaborative way, including with families. Be really careful around placement, headlines, detail, repetition, and prominence. Provide as much context as we can around the fact that mental illness, depression, substance abuse are the key driving factors. That people don't just wake up happy one day, sad the next, and do something drastic. There is a context we need to explain. Link readers really well into the support systems, and always provide balance and context, and not think that this is something we need to necessarily crusade on all the time. To end my talk, I want to go back to the title of the presentation, Challenging the Taboos, Reporting Suicide Effectively. So what should that mean? I'll just try to wrap things up. Effective reporting is not timid or oblique. It should be strong, clear, direct, and founded on thorough reporting. Effective reporting needs to engage with the reader and be relevant, and needs a strong element of human interest, but it should not exploit vulnerable privacies, trade on their grief, or intrude unnecessarily on their privacy. Effective reporting needs to keep issues in perspective and provide a wider view. It should avoid exaggeration or generalisation, and it should inform people without causing unnecessary harm. These are difficult matters for anyone to weigh up. We still are learning and growing in this area, but I'd be delighted to work with Spins and others in this room to keep working along this path, and happy to take your questions later. Thank you.